Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg, and this is the fourth video in my historical methods series where I talk about how we can use historical methods and different ways of studying history to show the truth of Christianity. And in this video I'm going to talk about the subject of historical context. Historical context is important when studying history, such as historical events and historical figures, because previous times and different places have different cultures, languages, and ideas, and taking this into account allows us to properly study these events and people and to understand them. So this ties a lot into the idea of judging people in history. So when I was working on my master's degree, there was a lot of discussion about this. Particularly, we talked a lot about the subject of Confederate statues, and then also discussions about, like, when it comes to certain people in American history that are glorified, like founding fathers, people like that, certain presidents, that maybe they had some certain racist beliefs. And so we had a lot of discussion about the debate, because there was a lot of debate at the time of, should we celebrate these people, and how should we remember them, given certain things they did or said that are considered commonly abhorrent morally today. And historical context came into that discussion a lot, because one thing that we have to consider, especially as historians, is there certainly are some people in the past who did or said some things that are considered immoral. But when we think about it, that was the common view for the day. Now, does that completely get them off the hook? Well, that's a different discussion. But it does kind of shape the question a little bit differently of, when it comes to their situation, their view that's considered prejudice today, that was, maybe the only view they were presented with growing up. And maybe there was even some threats of, you better not have another view than this, and so they kind of felt obligated to go along with it. Again, there's a lot to be said about that topic of whether they should have known better or not, or whether you can excuse their behavior. That's not what I'm going to be talking about in this video, but all that's to say, historical context is important as far as how common was that view, and what was at stake if they protested that view. So historical context, very important for these kinds of questions. So an interesting thing to look at when it comes to the Bible is Old Testament food laws, particularly those found in Leviticus 11. Probably a lot of Christians are familiar with there being food laws in the Old Testament, long list of stuff that they can and can't eat, the Jews, that is, of the Old Testament. And what's interesting is when we look at these, we see a lot of practical and health benefits to these, but when we take historical context into consideration, we realize that, wow, these were way ahead of their time. So there is this video that was kind of an interview with a food scientist and human nutrition expert, Dr. Jim Painter. I put a link to that video in the description of this video, and he talks about how there's basically scientific basis for all the food laws given by God in the Old Testament. One thing he does clarify is sometimes the Jews would add stuff to it. So, like, there's a verse that says, "Don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk," and the Jews in the Old Testament, turned that into don't eat meat with dairy. That wasn't a law given by God, and there's no necessarily health benefit to that. But he says that according to the Bible, the food laws given by God all have some kind of health benefit to them. And an example of that is that the Bible says that the Jews weren't supposed to eat fish that didn't have both fins and scales, and it turns out fish that don't have both fins and scales can be more likely to be toxic. So there is definitely a health benefit to that. And some additional research I did after watching that video with Dr. Painter is that germ theory wasn't established. It wasn't proven and popularized in the U.S. and Europe until about 1850 to 1920 is the rough range that I heard. And so you think about that, and Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and so I've heard about 3,400 years ago from multiple sources that's kind of when it's accepted that Moses wrote these books. And you compare that to the 18 and 1900s, that's a long time, very far ahead to get that information right. So you have about 1500 BC up until around the modern time. It's pretty incredible when you realize the historical context, and that's something that you might miss. If you read the Bible, you read those food laws with today's eyes and say, oh, of course don't eat, undercooked pork or something like that. It might seem like, oh, that's common sense. And I've actually heard that objection before. Some people will be like, oh, well, the food laws were common sense. That doesn't show any divine inspiration from God. Well, it's like if you put the historical context into play and you realize germ theory was on the scale of thousands of years away from being proven and accepted, and some other discoveries and innovations when it comes to discovering those things, you'll see that something pretty incredible was here to know that. So some benefits to understanding historical context. A big one is that it allows us to see details that we might otherwise miss. Big example is Jesus' deity references. Sometimes the New Testament will quote Jesus saying something or him doing something that if you're not familiar with the Old Testament or how people spoke in the first century, you might miss the significance of that quote or whatever action it was that he did. And so one example I'll give of that is a deity reference of Jesus that we find in Mark chapter 14, in verse 62 in particular. So Jesus, he is, actually I'll read verse 61 as well, or actually verse 60. I'll get a little more of the context in there. So Jesus is talking to the high priest. It says, starting in verse 60, and the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But he held his peace and answered nothing. And the high priest asked him, and said unto him, art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. And so Jesus offered his response there to the high priest. And so that's kind of what I want to zoom in on there is verse 62 where he's answering. And after he says, I am, saying, he is. When he says that part of, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. That sounds, like an extraordinary claim, but if you don't know what the language of the Old Testament is on this. You might not realize Jesus is actually referencing a passage in Daniel in the Old Testament, and so I'm going to flip to that and read that. So Daniel chapter 7 verses 13 and 14 says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. And so that's very significant, because you have in Daniel in these two verses talking about a Son of Man, and also Ancient of Days refers to God. And so this Son of Man says he comes with the clouds of heaven, and that he has this amazing kingdom. And so he kind of I heard Nabil Qureshi was talking about this. He's one of the sources I referenced in the description as well. He was breaking this down and talking about how the Son of Man is this divine figure that has this amazing title and kingdom, and then Jesus, when he's asked by that high priest who he is, and he says that I am that Son of Man. That's an extraordinary claim of Jesus' deity. And so sometimes people will ask, where in the Bible, you Christians say that Jesus is God, he's the Son of God. Where does he himself claim that? Well, I think a reason why people sometimes think that Jesus didn't claim to be God is because they don't know what to look for. Jesus made different claims like that, and there's also places where he refers to himself as I am, which is what God called himself in the Old Testament. So Jesus makes different divine claims for himself, and if we're not familiar with the historical context, because in the first century they would have just had the Old Testament, and they would have been more familiar with that. Some people would have, and so Jesus was kind of speaking with how he knew people at the time would understand. And something that actually shows that is when I was talking about that passage in Mark where Jesus is talking to the high priest, and he makes this claim after he says that essentially when he says, you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. The next verse tells us how the high priest reacted to that. Verse 63 says, Then the high priest rent his clothes and saith, What need we any further witness? And verse 64 says, Ye have heard the blasphemy, what think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. And so the high priest understood what Jesus was saying. The high priest is asking him who he is. Jesus essentially says, I'm God, and the priest is, how could you say that? That's blasphemy. It's essentially, when we look at that and we understand that context, the wider context of the chapter, we can see that amazing detail of what Jesus was saying. So overall, historical context is important to studying history, and doing that with the Bible shows the truth of who Jesus was and Christianity. So hope you found this video informative, and until next time, God bless.